officer.
Sir, I need to see some ID. We've had reports of suspicious activity in this area.
I'm sitting on a bench reading a book. What's suspicious about that?
Do you have identification or not?
I'm a psychiatrist at the hospital across the street. I eat lunch here every single day.
I don't care if you're the president. ID now.
Is it because I'm black?
The sunny Friday afternoon of March 8, 2024, was peaceful when Dr. Marcus Williams, a 47-year-old clinical psychologist who served as the police department's official psychiatrist, sat down on his favorite bench at Harborside Park for his daily lunch break. It was 2:12 p.m. when he opened the forensic psychology book he had been reading, settled comfortably in the light blue dress shirt and khaki pants he wore for his therapy sessions at the station, and began reading while occasionally watching the waves lap against the nearby pier. Dr. Williams had made this same routine 3 or 4 times a week for the past 6 years. Buy a sandwich from the nearby deli, walk to the park, sit on that specific bench overlooking the water, and spend 40 minutes reading before returning for his afternoon sessions, evaluating police officers for fitness for duty, and providing therapy for those dealing with trauma or stress. But what began as a routine lunch break transformed into a confrontation that would expose blatant racial profiling and cost an officer his career when he approached the department's own psychiatrist and accused him of suspicious behavior for reading a book in a public park. Marcus Williams held a Ph.D. in clinical psychology from Stanford University and had spent 22 years working in various capacities within law enforcement. He had begun his career providing psychological evaluations for police recruits, had expanded to providing ongoing therapy for officers dealing with traumatic incidents, and had eventually become a full-time official psychiatrist for one of the state's largest police departments. Dr. Williams was responsible for evaluating all officer candidates during the hiring process, providing fitness for duty assessments when officers were involved in shootings or other traumatic incidents, offering confidential counseling for officers dealing with stress or personal issues, and training supervisors on how to recognize mental health warning signs in their officers. He had conducted thousands of evaluations over the years and was deeply respected within the department for his professionalism, confidentiality, and genuine understanding of the unique challenges police officers faced. The officer who would approach Dr. Williams that afternoon was Tyler Brennan, an 8-year patrol officer with a history that included 4 previous complaints for racial profiling and a reputation among some colleagues for being overly zealous in questioning black people in public spaces. Brennan had developed a pattern over the years of patrolling public parks and recreational areas, looking for people he judged didn't belong there or were doing something suspicious. He had specifically targeted black men in casual or business clothes, apparently assuming they were in parks during weekdays because they were unemployed or doing something questionable, rather than legitimately enjoying public spaces during work breaks. That specific afternoon, Brennan was making his routine rounds through Harborside Park when he saw Dr. Williams sitting on a bench reading his book. There was nothing objectively suspicious about the scene. A middle-aged man in professional clothes sitting on a public bench on a sunny afternoon, reading a book with a backpack beside him. The park was filled with other visitors doing similar activities, walking, picnicking, reading, simply enjoying the pleasant weather. But Brennan saw a black man in business attire at the park during work hours and apparently decided to investigate. He had no service call, no complaints from other park visitors, no legitimate reason to approach a person sitting quietly reading in a public space. He simply made an assumption based on race that something seemed out of place. Brennan activated his body camera per protocol and walked toward the bench where Dr. Williams was sitting. Dr. Williams noticed the officer approaching and immediately recognized Brennan as someone he had evaluated during the hiring process 8 years earlier. Dr. Williams clearly remembered the evaluation because Brennan had exhibited some concerning signs during psychological testing, including elevated scores on measures of authoritarianism and responses that suggested implicit racial bias. Dr. Williams had noted those concerns in his evaluation report and had recommended Brennan receive additional training on bias and community interactions before being released to solo patrol. He didn't know if that recommendation had been followed, but evidently Brennan had been hired and was now working as an officer. Dr. Williams saved his page, closed his book, and looked up as Brennan stopped in front of the bench. He recognized Brennan likely wouldn't recognize him outside the context of the evaluation office, and while wearing casual clothes instead of the suits he usually wore for official assessments. Dr. Williams decided not to identify himself immediately, curious about why Brennan had approached him, and wanting to see how the officer would conduct the interaction. As a clinical psychologist specializing in law enforcement behavior, Dr. Williams was professionally interested in observing whether Brennan had developed appropriate communication skills or whether the warning signs from his original evaluation had manifested in problematic behavior. Brennan began by asking Dr. Williams what he was doing in the park. The question itself was revealing, implying a man sitting on a public bench needed to justify his presence. Dr. Williams responded politely. He was having his lunch break, reading a book and enjoying the weather. He gestured to his book and the park scenery, as if the answer wasn't completely obvious. Brennan looked at the book, then at Dr. Williams's backpack, then back at his face. He asked where Dr. Williams worked and why he was in the park during work hours. Dr. Williams, whose experience both as a black man and as a mental health professional had taught him to remain calm during potentially problematic encounters, responded, he worked nearby and often spent his lunch breaks at the park. He didn't offer specific details about his employer, curious about how far Brennan would take this without proper justification. Brennan wasn't satisfied with Dr. Williams's answer. He pressed further, asking specifically what kind of work Dr. Williams did that allowed him to take long lunch breaks in parks during weekdays. The question carried a clear implication that Brennan doubted Dr. Williams had legitimate employment, an assumption based purely on seeing a black man in a park during work hours. Dr. Williams responded he worked in the mental health field and that his lunch break was part of his regular schedule. He kept his answer vague, still observing how Brennan would conduct the interaction without knowledge of who he was actually interrogating. Dr. Williams was mentally taking notes on Brennan's body language, choice of questions, and underlying assumptions, all while maintaining a calm expression and professional composure. Brennan then asked to see Dr. Williams's identification. Dr. Williams asked politely under what legal authority Brennan was demanding identification from someone sitting on a public bench reading a book. Brennan responded he had the right to verify the identity of people acting suspiciously in public parks. Dr. Williams asked what specific behavior he had exhibited that seemed suspicious. Brennan stumbled slightly, then said it was unusual to see someone dressed professionally sitting alone in the park during a weekday, that it raised questions about what the person was really doing there. The logic was circular and revealing. Brennan was essentially saying being well-dressed in a park was suspicious because well-dressed people should be at work, creating a catch-22 where any behavior could be interpreted as suspicious through a lens of bias. Dr. Williams noted calmly that multiple other people in the park were sitting alone, reading, using laptops, or simply enjoying the weather, and asked if Brennan was questioning all of them too, or if he had singled out Dr. Williams specifically. Brennan didn't directly answer the question, instead repeating his demand for identification. Dr. Williams said he would provide identification once Brennan articulated specific reasonable suspicion of criminal activity, but that simply sitting on a public bench reading a book didn't create such suspicion under any reasonable legal interpretation. He also noted that, as a mental health professional familiar with law and law enforcement policy, he understood his constitutional rights perfectly well. Dr. Williams's mention of being familiar with law enforcement law seemed to irritate Brennan, rather than give him pause. Brennan said people who knew their rights were often those with something to hide, that innocent individuals usually just cooperated when officers asked reasonable questions. Dr. Williams recognized the tactic, an attempt to frame exercising constitutional rights as evidence of guilt, and responded that knowing your rights and choosing to exercise them didn't create suspicion of wrongdoing, that in fact the opposite was true, that a free society depended on citizens understanding and asserting their constitutional protections. He also noted Brennan's demands were anything but reasonable, given he hadn't articulated any specific behavior beyond sitting on a public bench. At this point, a middle-aged woman named Patricia Henderson, who was walking through the park with her dog, noticed the interaction and slowed to observe. Patricia was a retired attorney who frequented the park regularly and had seen Dr. Williams there countless times over the years, always sitting on the same bench, always reading, never causing any disturbance. She also immediately recognized what was happening, an officer questioning a black man doing completely innocent activity while ignoring all other park visitors. Patricia stopped at a safe distance, but within earshot, her phone discreetly recording the interaction. Brennan, realizing he wasn't making progress in getting Dr. Williams to provide identification voluntarily, shifted tactics. He asked about the contents of Dr. Williams's backpack, saying he needed to verify there were no dangerous items or contraband. Dr. Williams responded, Brennan had no legal basis to search his property without consent or probable cause, and that he wasn't consenting to any search. Brennan said refusing a search created additional suspicion. Dr. Williams, whose patience was beginning to wear thin though he maintained a professional tone, responded that refusing to submit to an illegal search was a constitutional right, not evidence of wrongdoing, and that police officers were supposedly trained to understand that basic distinction. Brennan then made a statement that would reveal exactly how deeply his biases were driving his actions. He said he patrolled that park regularly and usually didn't see people like Dr. Williams there during weekdays, that his presence seemed outside the normal pattern. The phrase, people like you, hung in the air, and while Brennan hadn't explicitly specified race, the implication was crystal clear. Dr. Williams asked calmly what exactly Brennan meant by people like you. Brennan stumbled, then said he meant people in business clothes instead of exercise clothes, but the damage was done. The body camera had captured the phrase, and the context made clear Brennan was making assumptions based on race. Patricia, still recording at a distance, decided to intervene. She approached and told Brennan she had witnessed the entire interaction and that she had seen no suspicious behavior on the part of the gentleman sitting on the bench. She also mentioned she was a retired attorney and regular park visitor, and that she had seen that same gentleman there dozens of times over the years, always behaving appropriately. Brennan told Patricia she needed to move along, that this was a police investigation and didn't concern her. Patricia responded that, as a citizen witnessing what appeared to be harassment of a legitimate park visitor, it absolutely was her concern, and that she would continue observing to ensure the gentleman's rights were respected. Brennan, now visibly frustrated by having his authority questioned by both Dr. Williams and Patricia, made the mistake that would transform a routine harassment incident into a career disaster. He told Dr. Williams that if he didn't provide identification immediately, he would be detained for suspicious behavior and investigated further. The threat was both legally baseless and revealing of how willing Brennan was to escalate a situation based purely on his racial assumptions. Dr. Williams asked calmly if Brennan was threatening to detain him for reading a book on a public park bench. Brennan confirmed yes, that Dr. Williams was being uncooperative and that such behavior warranted additional investigation. Patricia immediately spoke up, telling Brennan she had recorded the entire interaction and that it was clear he was harassing an innocent citizen without any articulable reasonable suspicion. She also noted that, as an attorney, she recognized a clear Fourth Amendment violation when she saw one, and that Brennan was creating significant liability for both himself and the department by continuing this illegal detention. Brennan told Patricia interfering with a police investigation could result in her own arrest. Patricia responded that standing in a public space while recording a police interaction didn't constitute interference under any legal precedent, and that she had every right to document what she was witnessing. Dr. Williams made the decision to reveal information he had been holding back, recognizing Brennan was clearly prepared to escalate the situation to the point of physical detention. He told Brennan calmly but clearly that he was Dr. Marcus Williams, a licensed clinical psychologist who served as the police department's official psychiatrist, that he had in fact conducted Brennan's psychological evaluation during his hiring process 8 years earlier, and that Brennan was currently harassing the same mental health professional responsible for evaluating officers' fitness for duty. He noted he had professional identification in his backpack if Brennan required seeing it, but that he was stating his position now to give Brennan an opportunity to reconsider his actions before he got himself into even more serious trouble. The revelation should have immediately ended the confrontation. A reasonable officer would have been mortified to realize he had been harassing the department's own psychiatrist, would have apologized profusely, and would have backed down, recognizing a serious error in judgment. But Brennan's reaction would reveal exactly how deeply his racial assumptions had clouded his ability to process information that contradicted his prejudices. He questioned whether Dr. Williams was telling the truth, suggesting people often lied about their occupations to avoid police scrutiny. He told Dr. Williams that if he really were the department psychiatrist, he would have identified himself immediately instead of being difficult about providing identification. Dr. Williams responded he had no obligation to identify himself to an officer making an approach without legal justification, that citizens weren't required to facilitate illegal stops by voluntarily providing information, and that the fact Brennan questioned whether he could actually be a licensed mental health professional based apparently on how he looked demonstrated exactly the racial bias that had driven this entire interaction. He also noted that, as the clinical psychologist who had evaluated Brennan specifically, he was now witnessing firsthand the manifestation of the same warning signs of bias he had documented in Brennan's evaluation report 8 years earlier. Dr. Williams asked if Brennan had in fact received the additional training on bias and community interactions that had been recommended, or if that recommendation had been ignored. The mention of the evaluation report clearly hit a nerve. Brennan knew psychological evaluations were part of every officer's personnel file, and that negative recommendations or concerns raised during evaluations could impact careers. But rather than backing down, Brennan doubled down. He demanded to see Dr. Williams's professional identification, saying he needed to verify the claim before ending the investigation. Dr. Williams opened his backpack slowly and deliberately, keeping movements visible to the body camera, and retrieved his professional identification wallet. It contained his state clinical psychologist license, his official police department identification card, identifying him as department psychiatrist, and his professional business card listing his credentials and contact information. Brennan examined the identification, his eyes widening as he processed that everything Dr. Williams had said was true. He was looking at an official department identification card, showing the man he had been harassing for reading a book in a park was indeed the department's senior psychiatrist, the professional who literally had power to recommend whether officers were psychologically fit for duty. But even confronted with undeniable physical evidence, Brennan didn't immediately apologize or acknowledge his error. Instead, he tried to justify his actions by saying he was just being cautious, that the park had had issues with suspicious activity, that he was doing his job keeping public areas safe. Dr. Williams, whose professional patience had finally run out, responded, "There was nothing cautious about racially profiling a legitimate park visitor based on assumptions about race and employment, that keeping public areas safe didn't require harassing people reading books on benches, and that Brennan's job was to enforce law based on observed behavior, not prejudices about who belonged in certain spaces." He also noted that, as the department psychiatrist, he would be reporting this interaction through appropriate channels and recommending Brennan undergo a full psychological evaluation to determine if he was fit to continue on patrol. Patricia, still recording, said aloud, for the benefit of the video, that she had witnessed an officer harassing the police department's psychiatrist without any legal justification, that the officer had questioned the psychiatrist's credentials based apparently on his race, and that the officer had threatened illegal detention when challenged about his actions. She also stated she would be providing her recording to both the police department and civil rights organizations to ensure this incident was properly investigated. At this moment, a second officer arrived in a patrol car, apparently responding to Brennan's radio transmission or a dispatcher call. The officer who exited was Sergeant Jennifer Martinez, a 19-year veteran who served as shift supervisor and who happened to know Dr. Williams well from multiple professional interactions over the years. Martinez had herself undergone therapy with Dr. Williams after an officer-involved shooting 3 years earlier, and she had deep respect for his professionalism and ability to help officers process traumatic events. She immediately recognized Dr. Williams sitting on the bench, and her expression shifted from professional curiosity to absolute shock as she realized Brennan had apparently stopped the department psychiatrist. Martinez approached quickly and asked Brennan what the situation was. Brennan began explaining he had been investigating a suspicious individual in the park who had identified himself as the department psychiatrist, but had been uncooperative. Before Brennan could finish, Martinez cut him off and said 3 words that made Brennan's face go gray. Martinez asked Brennan if he had any idea who he had just stopped. Brennan said the individual claimed to be the department psychiatrist, but had refused to provide identification initially. Martinez shook her head in disbelief, and what she said next was captured perfectly by Brennan's body camera. Martinez told Brennan the gentleman sitting on that bench was Dr. Marcus Williams, the department's official psychiatrist for over 6 years, that he was responsible for evaluating all officers for fitness for duty, that he had provided critical therapy for countless officers, including herself, and that he was one of the most respected professionals the department worked with. She also noted Dr. Williams had been coming to the same bench for lunch breaks regularly for years. That half the department knew about his routine because many officers had seen him there, and that Brennan had just harassed literally the last person in the department anyone would want to antagonize given his role in career evaluations. Martinez immediately addressed Dr. Williams with formal respect, calling him Dr. Williams and apologizing profusely on behalf of the department. She expressed genuine shock that anyone would have stopped him during his routine lunch break, particularly without any legal justification. Dr. Williams appreciated Martinez's professionalism, but made clear this wasn't about him personally feeling offended, but about the fact Brennan had demonstrated a clear pattern of racial profiling that likely affected countless other citizens who didn't have his credentials or knowledge to challenge misconduct. He noted that if he were just an ordinary citizen instead of the department psychiatrist, Brennan might have escalated the situation even further, potentially resulting in illegal detention or worse. Martinez turned to Brennan with an expression mixing anger, embarrassment, and professional concern. She asked Brennan what specific reasonable suspicion he had to approach Dr. Williams. Brennan stumbled over his response, mentioning it seemed unusual to see someone in business clothes at the park during a weekday, and that he was checking on potentially suspicious activity. Martinez asked directly if Brennan had questioned any of the other people sitting alone in the park that afternoon. Brennan admitted no. Martinez then asked what specifically about Dr. Williams had created suspicion that warranted a stop when multiple other park visitors were doing identical activity. Brennan couldn't articulate an answer beyond vague statements about following instinct and being cautious. Martinez told Brennan he needed to return to his vehicle immediately and make no additional statements without union representation present. She also informed Brennan he was being removed from patrol effective immediately and would be reported to his shift commander for internal affairs investigation. Brennan tried to protest, saying he was just doing his job and that he didn't mean to offend anyone. Dr. Williams intervened, noting intent mattered less than impact, that Brennan had clearly stopped him based on racial profiling, and that his initial refusal to believe Dr. Williams could be the department psychiatrist when presented with that information revealed deeply entrenched bias that made him unfit for public interactions. Patricia introduced herself to Martinez and offered to provide her video recording as evidence. She explained she had witnessed the entire interaction from beginning to end, and that the video clearly showed Brennan approaching Dr. Williams without cause, asking questions based on assumptions about race and employment rather than observed behavior, threatening illegal detention, and then questioning Dr. Williams's credentials even when presented with official identification. Martinez thanked Patricia and obtained her contact information, assuring her investigators would reach out to obtain a formal copy of the video and witness statement. Dr. Williams collected his belongings, placed his book back in his backpack, and stood up. He told Martinez he would be filing a formal report documenting the incident and his observations of Brennan's behavior. As the department psychiatrist, Dr. Williams had a professional responsibility to report any officer behavior that suggested psychological unfitness for duty, and what he had witnessed from Brennan certainly met that threshold. He also noted he would be recommending Brennan undergo a full independent psychological evaluation before being allowed to return to any patrol duties, and that he would be recusing himself from conducting that evaluation, given he was now a victim of Brennan's misconduct. Martinez assured Dr. Williams the department would take this with the utmost seriousness, that all video evidence would be preserved, and that a full investigation would be conducted. She also expressed personal concern for Dr. Williams's well-being and asked if he needed anything. Dr. Williams thanked her, but said he was fine, that as a mental health professional, he knew how to process the experience, though the incident was a painful reminder that not even professional position and knowledge of law provided complete protection from racial profiling. He noted his concern was less for himself and more for all the other victims of Brennan who hadn't had the resources or knowledge to challenge his misconduct. Brennan was instructed to drive directly to the station and report to the shift commander. During the drive back, he apparently realized the gravity of his situation because he called the union representative before even arriving. When he reached the station, his lieutenant had already been alerted by Martinez about the incident and was waiting with the police chief, who happened to be at the station for an unrelated meeting. The body camera recording was immediately preserved and copied to multiple locations with documented chain of custody. The chief personally reviewed the video and his expression grew progressively more serious as the recording proceeded. The video showed everything in painful detail. Brennan approaching Dr. Williams without reasonable suspicion, asking questions that revealed assumptions about race and employment, threatening illegal detention when challenged, questioning Dr. Williams's credentials when revealed, and making the telling comment about people like you not normally being in the park during weekdays. Brennan's attempt to justify his actions by saying he was being cautious was clearly contradicted by video evidence showing he had singled out Dr. Williams specifically, while ignoring other park visitors doing identical activity. Brennan's questioning of whether Dr. Williams was telling the truth about being the department psychiatrist, even when confronted with official identification, demonstrated bias so deep it blinded him to evidence contradicting his assumptions. The Internal Affairs Division opened a formal investigation the following morning, but the case had already attracted extraordinary attention within the department because it involved the department's own psychiatrist as the victim. Officers throughout the organization talked about the incident in shocked and disbelieving tones. Many knew Dr. Williams personally from evaluations or therapy sessions, and the idea that one of their own would have stopped and harassed him for reading a book in a park was both embarrassing and deeply troubling. The police chief issued an internal memo noting investigation was underway and that the department would take the matter with utmost seriousness, also reminding all officers that racial profiling would not be tolerated under any circumstances. Investigators immediately obtained all available video evidence. Brennan's body camera recording, capturing the entire interaction from his point of view, Patricia's cell phone recording, providing additional angle and capturing verbal statements from all involved, and park security camera footage confirming Brennan had walked directly past multiple other park visitors before approaching Dr. Williams specifically. Together, the videos created a comprehensive record demonstrating Brennan had no reasonable suspicion for the stop, that he had singled out Dr. Williams based on race rather than behavior, and that he had questioned Dr. Williams's credentials based on assumptions about appearance. Investigators then pulled Brennan's complete history of stops and interactions over his 8 years with the department. What they discovered confirmed the incident with Dr. Williams was not an aberration, but the culmination of a long-standing pattern of problematic behavior. Brennan had received 4 previous complaints alleging racial profiling, all involving approaches of black people in public spaces, without clear, reasonable suspicion. One complaint involved a black college student being questioned about what he was doing at a public library where he was studying. Another involved a black businessman being stopped while walking through a commercial area during lunch break and questioned about whether he had employment. A third involved a black woman being interrogated about why she was sitting at a community center where she was waiting for a fitness class. None of the 4 previous complaints had resulted in significant discipline. Supervisors had consistently filed them away as misunderstandings or legitimate exercises of officer judgment, despite the obvious pattern of Brennan targeting black people doing perfectly normal activities in public spaces. Investigators discovered supervisors had failed to aggregate the multiple complaints to identify a pattern, instead treating each as an isolated incident. This failure in adequate supervision had allowed Brennan to operate for 8 years, with essentially zero accountability until finally stopping someone whose credentials and position made it impossible to ignore or minimize the incident. Critically, investigators also reviewed Dr. Williams's original psychological evaluations report of Brennan from 8 years earlier. The report was in Brennan's personnel file and contained observations that now seemed prophetically concerning. Dr. Williams had noted Brennan exhibited elevated scores on measures of authoritarianism, and a tendency to categorize people based on demographic characteristics rather than individual behavior. He had also documented that Brennan's responses to hypothetical scenarios involving community interactions suggested implicit bias that could manifest in racial profiling if not addressed through training. Dr. Williams's recommendation had been that Brennan receive mandatory additional training focused on implicit bias, community interaction, and constitutional rights before being assigned to solo patrol. Investigators confirmed with the Human Resources Department that the recommendation for additional training had been noted in Brennan's file but never actually implemented. Brennan had completed standard academy training but had never received the additional specialized modules Dr. Williams had specifically recommended. The failure to follow the department psychiatrist's recommendation represented a significant systemic failure that had allowed an officer with known warning signs to be placed in a position where he could act on his biases without adequate intervention. This discovery transformed the investigation from individual misconduct by Brennan into a much broader examination of departmental supervision and training failures. The investigation report was completed 4 weeks after the park incident, and its findings were devastating for both Brennan and multiple levels of departmental supervision. Investigators determined Brennan had violated numerous departmental policies, including prohibitions against racial profiling, requirements to articulate reasonable suspicion before investigative approaches, standards of professional conduct, and requirements to treat all citizens with respect and dignity. The report specifically found Brennan had no legal basis to approach Dr. Williams, that his selection of Dr. Williams for scrutiny while ignoring other park visitors doing identical activity demonstrated clear racial profiling, that his threat of detention was abuse of authority, and that his questioning of Dr. Williams's credentials revealed bias so deep it blinded him to evidence contradicting his assumptions. But the report went beyond just documenting Brennan's misconduct. It identified 3 supervisors who had filed away his previous complaints without adequate investigation or recognition of emerging pattern. It also severely criticized the department's failure to implement Dr. Williams's training recommendation from 8 years earlier, noting that if that additional training had been provided, Brennan might have developed awareness of his biases and learned to control his actions in ways that prevented the pattern of misconduct from developing. The investigators' recommendation was immediate employment termination for Brennan, permanent certification revocation, disciplinary action for 3 supervisors ranging from suspensions to demotions, and comprehensive review of departmental processes for implementing psychiatrist recommendations. Brennan was officially fired 6 weeks after stopping Dr. Williams at Harborside Park. His 8-year career in law enforcement ended by a pattern of racial profiling that had operated unchecked for years until finally targeting a victim who had both professional expertise and position within the department itself to demand full accountability. The State Board of Police Standards revoked his certification permanently, with a notation in his file indicating termination for misconduct involving racial profiling of the department psychiatrist, ensuring he could never work in law enforcement anywhere in the state. The swiftness and finality of the termination reflected both the gravity of the violations and the fact the victim was the mental health professional responsible for evaluating officers' fitness for duty, making it absolutely impossible for the department to defend or minimize Brennan's misconduct. But the consequences extended far beyond just Brennan's firing. The 3 supervisors who had filed away his previous complaints without adequate investigation faced disciplinary action. One sergeant who had specifically dismissed 2 separate complaints as likely misunderstandings without conducting any investigative interviews was demoted to senior officer, a significant loss in authority and pay. 2 other supervisors received 4-week unpaid suspensions and were placed on performance improvement plans requiring retraining on citizen complaint processes and identifying patterns of misconduct. The message was clear. Supervisors who ignored warning signs and failed to aggregate complaints to identify patterns would face consequences as much as officers who committed misconduct. More significantly, the department implemented new policy requiring all training recommendations made by the department psychiatrist in recruit evaluations be tracked in a separate database and verified as complete before recruits were released to solo patrol. The policy also required the psychiatrist be notified if any recommendation couldn't be implemented due to resource constraints or scheduling, giving the psychiatrist opportunity to weigh in on whether the recruit should proceed without recommended training or be held back until training could be provided. This policy change transformed the psychiatrist from a consultant whose recommendations could be ignored into a mandatory gatekeeper whose input was now an essential part of the hiring process. Dr. Williams filed a federal civil lawsuit against Brennan personally and the police department 7 months after the incident, alleging violations of 4th and 14th Amendment rights, false imprisonment, intentional infliction of emotional distress, and municipal liability for failure to properly train and supervise officers with known patterns of racial profiling. The lawsuit sought compensatory damages for the harassment and emotional distress, punitive damages to punish the misconduct, and comprehensive policy changes. His legal team built a case grounded not just in the multiple video recordings, but also in Dr. Williams' original psychological evaluation report, documenting concerns about Brennan's bias and recommendation for additional training that was ignored, creating a powerful narrative of a mental health professional who had identified a problem, offered a solution, seen his recommendation ignored, and then become victim of the exact consequences he had predicted. The city initially tried to defend the case, but the evidence was simply too overwhelming and the implications too embarrassing. The idea that the department had ignored its own psychiatrist's recommendation about an officer with warning signs of bias allowed that officer to operate for 8 years, racially profiling citizens, including eventually the psychiatrist himself, created liability no amount of legal arguments could overcome. The body camera video showing Brennan questioning whether Dr. Williams could really be the department psychiatrist based on how he looked was particularly damning, demonstrating bias so deep Brennan couldn't accept evidence contradicting his assumptions even when confronted with official identification. The final settlement, reached 14 months after the incident, awarded Dr. Williams $1,200,000 in damages, one of the largest racial profiling settlements in the state. But for Dr. Williams, who had a comfortable salary and financial security, the money was less important than the policy reforms included in the settlement. The city agreed to implement mandatory quarterly retraining on racial profiling and implicit bias for all officers with mandatory assessments, ensuring officers actually absorb the material rather than just passively attending. The settlement also required creation of an independent civilian review board with power to review racial profiling complaints and recommend discipline, with specific representation from licensed psychologists who could provide professional perspective on whether officer behavior suggested psychological bias. Perhaps most importantly, the settlement required the department to publish annual data on all stops and investigative approaches disaggregated by race, allowing researchers and the community to identify patterns of racial profiling before they escalated to serious misconduct. The settlement also included a requirement that any officers with 3 or more racial profiling complaints within a 5-year period automatically undergo full psychological evaluation conducted by an independent mental health professional to determine if they were fit to continue on patrol. This provision essentially institutionalized the exact kind of early intervention that could have prevented Brennan's pattern from developing if supervisors had paid attention to the complaints they were receiving. Dr. Williams continued serving as the department psychiatrist, but the incident had changed him in ways he would process through his own therapy and clinical supervision. He became more assertive in his evaluations about flagging concerns regarding bias and in following up to ensure his training recommendations were actually implemented. He also developed a new training module specifically focused on helping officers recognize when their assumptions about race were influencing their stopping decisions, using his own experience as an anonymized case study about an officer who had stopped a respected professional based purely on assumptions about race and appearance. The incident also affected how Dr. Williams conducted psychological evaluations of recruits. He became more specific in his recommendations, not just noting a recruit needed additional training, but outlining exactly what modules should be completed, what competencies should be demonstrated, and what follow-up assessments should be conducted to verify training had been effective. He also began including in his reports explicit statement about whether a recruit should be released to solo patrol before completing recommended training, or if the recruit represented sufficient risk that they should be held back until training was completed. This additional specificity made it much harder for the department to ignore or minimize his recommendations. Patricia Henderson, the retired attorney who had intervened and documented the incident, became a vocal advocate for using witness recording to create police accountability. She gave multiple interviews on local news outlets about the importance of witnesses intervening when they saw possible misconduct, about how video recording created a record that couldn't be disputed or reinterpreted, and about why ordinary citizens had a responsibility to help protect each other from abuse of authority. Patricia also worked with civil rights organizations to develop guides on safely recording police interactions, resources that were distributed through community centers and online. Harborside Park, where everything had happened, remained one of Dr. Williams's favorite places, and he continued having lunch breaks there several times a week, though he was now always conscious that even an activity as simple as reading a book on a public bench could become a racial confrontation. He occasionally saw other officers patrolling through the park, and they now always waved or greeted him respectfully, having all heard the story about what had happened, and not wanting to make Brennan's similar mistake. The picnic table near his favorite bench became an informal gathering spot, where officers who were dealing with mental health issues sometimes stopped to speak casually with Dr. Williams during their rounds, knowing he was accessible and understanding even outside formal office environment. The video recordings of the incident became widely used training tools in multiple contexts. Police academies across the state used the videos to teach recruits about the dangers of making assumptions based on race rather than observed behavior, about how implicit bias could blind officers to evidence contradicting their assumptions, and about the consequences of racial profiling, even when victims were respected professionals. The video of Brennan questioning whether Dr. Williams could really be the department psychiatrist became a particularly powerful example of how racial bias operated through disbelief about Black people's professional capabilities. Clinical psychology programs use the case as a teaching example about ethical boundaries and professional responsibilities. The fact Dr. Williams had identified concerns about Brennan's bias in the original evaluation, recommended specific intervention, seen his recommendation ignored, and then become victim of the exact consequences he had predicted, created a compelling narrative about why mental health professionals' recommendations in law enforcement contexts should be taken seriously. The case was used in courses on forensic psychology, professional ethics, and best practices for psychologists working with law enforcement agencies. Brennan disappeared from public life after his firing, his attempts to rebuild his career frustrated by the fact background checks for any security-related position would reveal his termination for racially profiling the police department's psychiatrist. He tried multiple jobs in unrelated fields, but employers who did basic online research invariably found news articles about the incident. Brennan eventually moved to another state and found work in a completely different field, his life permanently altered by 8 years of operating based on racial bias that finally manifested in such a publicly indefensible way it couldn't be ignored or minimized. The lasting legacy of the case extended far beyond a $1,200,000 settlement or one department's reforms. It became nationally cited in discussions about the importance of implementing mental health professionals' recommendations in law enforcement contexts, used in court cases establishing that not even department psychiatrists were immune to racial profiling, and incorporated into training about how implicit bias could blind officers to evidence contradicting their assumptions. The case demonstrated that systemic failures in following expert recommendations and aggregating complaints to identify patterns could allow misconduct to operate unchecked until finally reaching a crisis point. For Black communities, Dr. Williams's case offered validation of experiences Black professionals across all fields often faced. Having credentials questioned based on appearance, being treated with suspicion in public spaces regardless of professional position, having expertise dismissed when it contradicted others' racial assumptions. Dr. Williams's willingness to sue not just for personal compensation but to force systemic changes That would benefit others resonated with countless people who had experienced similar disrespect and bias, but hadn't had the resources or platform to demand accountability. For law enforcement professionals, the case provided a lesson about why the expertise of mental health professionals in departments should be respected and their recommendations implemented. The fact Dr. Williams had literally predicted in Brennan's evaluation report that he might engage in racial profiling if he didn't receive additional training, seen that recommendation ignored, and then been racially profiled by that same officer 8 years later, created a narrative that was impossible to dismiss or minimize. Departments across the country reviewed their processes for implementing psychiatrist recommendations and ensuring warning signs and evaluations were taken seriously. Dr. Williams occasionally reflected on that Friday afternoon in the park and the surreal experience of being stopped by an officer he had, evaluated years earlier, and whose warning signs he had documented. He thought about the 4 people who had complained about Brennan over the years, whose complaints were ignored, about how many other victims of Brennan's racial profiling never filed complaints, about how differently everything could have ended if only his original training recommendations had been followed. But he also thought about Patricia intervening to document and witness, about Martinez immediately recognizing something was wrong, about the chief taking the incident seriously, and implementing real reforms. And those memories gave him hope that systems could change when forced to confront their own failures. The forensic psychology book Dr. Williams had been reading that afternoon remained in his backpack for weeks after the incident before he could finally return to it. When he finally opened it again, he found the chapter he had been reading was about implicit bias in law enforcement decision-making, about how officers often made choices based on group categorization rather than individual behavior assessment, about evidence-based interventions to reduce bias operation. The irony wasn't lost on him that he had been reading about the exact psychological processes that were about to manifest in his own experience as a victim. The reforms that followed Dr. Williams's case were imperfect and faced resistance from some within law enforcement who saw changes as unnecessary bureaucracy or questioning of officer judgment. But they represented recognition that the professional expertise of clinical psychologists working with police departments should be respected, that warning signs of bias in evaluations should be taken seriously and addressed through training, that citizen complaints should be aggregated to identify patterns rather than treated as isolated incidents, and that accountability should apply both to supervisors who failed to act and to officers who committed misconduct. And while reforms alone couldn't eliminate racial profiling or guarantee no other black professional would be questioned about whether they really occupied their positions, they represented progress won through one psychiatrist's willingness to transform his own experience of injustice into a catalyst for systemic change that would eventually benefit countless others.